Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. This is Josh Bertram. I'm the faithful host. Our political host could not be here today, so we wish you well. Will, we're thinking about you. But today we have on the show Jake Meador. Jake is the editor-in-chief of Mere Orthodoxy. It's an online magazine covering the Christian faith in the public sphere, and a contributing editor with Plough. His first book was In Search of the Common Good, Christian Fidelity in a Fractured World. And Jake's work has been published in First Things, National Review, Books and Culture, Commonweal, Christianity Today, Front Porch Media, and the University Bookman. And he lives with his wife and children in their hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska. So what was it? Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So the most important question, what was it like growing up in Lincoln, Nebraska?
Well, it's actually, my wife is from Alabama.
Okay.
So she's got a different background than I do. I mean, it's a university town in the Midwest. The way I've explained it to some people is like, if you're familiar with the Twin Cities in Minnesota, take St. Paul and subtract the rest of the metro, and you kind of have Lincoln. And especially these days, Big Ten university town, big tech scene. So it's, growing up here is a little different, much smaller back then, but
yes,
it's home. I love it. So I'm grateful I can live in my hometown.
Oh, I'm sure that's awesome. Well, I'm super fascinated by your work. We invited you on as I was looking to. I'm always looking for people to invite onto the podcast, and I saw your book, your newest book that you just published, which is What Are Christians For? Life Together at the End of the World. Well, that is that's an interesting title there. What's going on behind that title? What's the book about? Why'd you write
it? I was trying to help Christians, particularly conservative Protestants, I guess just Protestants, find Christian resources for thinking about the various social problems that are kind of pressing in on us on all sides. And I think what's interesting is I started writing the book, let's see, I think it would have been early 2019, I think, is actually when I started on it. And I mean, even since then, we've had COVID and now Russia-Ukraine war. And so that was kind of what the subtitle was born out of. The subtitle came a ways later. And the idea was just...
Intriguing subtitle.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing, I think, the unwinding and ending of the kind of unipolar post-Cold War American world. COVID undercut a lot of things. We now have a land war going on in Eastern Europe with Russia. But I mean, even prior to that, there was a fragmentation of our institutions, politically, culturally, religiously. All of these different kind of features that made the 90s and early 2000s, and even the 80s in a lot of ways, I think feel fairly stable. It's kind of the world that the end of history talk came out of. Many of the conditions and institutions and shared beliefs that undergirded that world are failing. And so we find ourselves kind of in, Mark Sayers calls it a gray zone. It's this kind of historical moment where you're clearly leaving behind one era, but no one really knows what you're coming into. And so I was trying to write something that could help people get their bearings. I don't know where the world is going to be in 5 years, but I do know what the church has traditionally said about the obligation Christians have to neighbor. I know what Scripture teaches about what it means to love neighbor, what it means to steward your wealth well. And so I was trying to take these unchanging principles and present them in an engaging way connected to what we see happening around us.
I love it. That's so cool.
Thank you.
The book is absolutely fascinating. One of the questions that it starts with in the description is, what does Christian political witness look like in our day? And I think that's a great question to ask. What does it look like in our day? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm summarizing all of the argument of the book in a few minutes is always hard.
Well, we can start to unpack the argument.
Yeah. So we can kind of build out from here. So I think where I start in the book is to say that I think the witness of the American church, particularly the white church in America, has generally across time been to accommodate ourselves to certain kind of more American than Christian norms and beliefs and practices, such that you kind of end up with this idea that a certain kind of middle-class bourgeois lifestyle is kind of the table stakes for getting serious about Christian discipleship. So once you have that lifestyle secured, okay, now I can start thinking about all these things that Jesus tells me I should be doing. But prior to that, it's fine to work a job that takes you away from your family all the time. It's fine to do any number of things that seem to be contrary to the way of Jesus, but we find ways of justifying them because we feel like we have to have this kind of car, we have to have this level of material security, political security, this kind of house, this kind of neighborhood. And until we get those, there's a certain sense in which many of the claims that Christ makes in our lives as, say, his followers kind of get held in abeyance, I think. And you can apply this to any number of issues across time. Obviously, one of the big places to go is with the many ways that the American church accommodated itself to racism throughout the 19th century and into the 20th and 21st centuries. Yeah. But it's not just there. I think when you compare what Christians have historically said about wealth and money to the way that a lot of Americans think about these things, that's a pretty, in many cases, a pretty alarming example of accommodation as well. So you think about and I have some of these quotes in the first book, actually. There's a commentary, John Calvin in a commentary on Isaiah basically says, I'm not remembering it verbatim, but yes, you have a right to private property, but your right to private property is contingent on your neighbor's right to eat and have shelter. And Calvin's mentor, Martin Bucer, would say that any nation that allows poverty to exist, where people beg because they think that's the only way they're going to be able to support themselves, if your nation allows that kind of poverty to exist, you are just categorically not a Christian nation, because Christian societies don't let that kind of poverty exist.
Wow.
And I'm not reaching from some kind of, I don't know, weird mid-20th century Christian socialist source here. I'm working with John Calvin and Martin Bucer, who are at the head of the Reformation. They defined the trajectory of the tradition in so many ways, and that's what they said when it came to wealth. And yet, I think if you were to say those things in a lot of evangelical congregations, people would not like you very much. I mean, I've even had this kind of dark joke in my own head, if somebody stood up and recited the Magnificat, Mary's prayer in Luke 1, she meets Elizabeth, where she talks about sending the rich away, tearing down the proud, all of these things. If you were to read that in a church and not tell people ahead of time that you're reading from the Bible, you're reading words from Mary, the mother of Christ, you just presented those words to the church without that context, what would happen?
That's a great question.
And I'm sure the answer will differ with every church, but I'm also a little scared of what the answer would be in a lot of churches.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the starting point, is trying to identify the ways in which we neutralize, sterilize the teachings of Christianity in the name of comfort and security and personal peace. Trying to identify those, expose them, and then subject all of our lives, private and public lives, to the teachings of the faith. Which it's weird to say in a country that has as much Christian history as America does. But I think there are a lot of areas of life that have not really been subjected to divine revelation very consistently.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree. There's this, we had Professor Tim Gombis on the show, and we've talked in our conversation with him. He made the point that I would always that he would read the Gospels and he would feel like, oh yeah, I'm the good guy in the Gospels. I'm the one that Jesus is reaching out to. I'm the good one of the story. And as he grew and his understanding and scholarship and everything, and started realizing we're the Pharisees. We're the ones that Jesus would be speaking to because of our wealth and our intellectual understanding and tradition and our knowledge, and because of the traditions that have grown up around the scriptures. Like, we're right in the center of that critique. It seems like of what Jesus would say, and politics are a huge part of this, right? Because the Pharisees, Paul, who was a Pharisee, he seemed to be trying to get rid of Christianity because it was going to prevent God from bringing about a political uprising, or a political purification of Israel, and then his entire view of politics was turned around. Right?
Jesus has a way of doing that to you.
He does. One of the things that you bring out in the book is that politics are to be defined kind of by the common good, right? Or fidelity. You kind of, to the good of all the members of society, no matter what race, no matter what religion, everybody. But you say that our modern politics, Western, is defined by a determination to bend the natural world and human life to our own political and economic ends. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? How are we doing that? How are we not hitting this mark of this fidelity to the common good of all members?
So maybe another way of getting at that same point, because common good can be kind of a promiscuous term sometimes. Another way of saying,
maybe even define common good.
Yeah, well, so this is another way of getting at it. This is just another semi-prominent Reformed figure from early in the tradition, a German political theorist named Althusius. He says that the purpose of politics is to make our necessary relationships mutually delightful. And so I can't live and sustain my own life in the world entirely on my own. I'm wearing clothing I did not make right now. I'm living in a house I did not build. I'm working on a computer I did not build. In all of these very basic ways that we don't even think about, we're drawn into relationships with other people out of necessity. And what Althusius is wanting to say is that often what happens is those relationships are structured in ways that are corrosive of virtue, that are often parasitic on one party or the other. And what we should be striving to is to structure our political lives so that these relationships are mutually uplifting, mutually enjoyable, mutually delightful. And so that is kind of my starting point in talking about what are politics for? Well, that's what they're for. It's a forum where we can, in response to Christ's call to love our neighbor, try to act and shape our societies in ways that these necessary relationships are enjoyable and pleasant for everyone. So that's the starting point. It's just a totally different starting point than the way a
And
lot
the necessary relationships. Do you mind? I mean, sorry, every now and then I'll just jump in just to make
Yeah, that's
sure
fine.
if there's like a clarifying thought. So necessary relationships, if I'm understanding you, like that, we have all these relations, like we have our immediate family, which we all would say, oh yeah, those are part of
Mhm.
my necessary relationships, but even moves beyond that, where we are so dependent on the things that other people do that have direct and indirect
Right.
impact on us, like making goods,
Yeah.
services, all that stuff, creating an environment that we can even, and a system of government that we can even
Mhm. The,
move around in. And
to maybe get as concrete as I think we can, the easiest way to eat in America, to take one example, is in a way that is harmful to landscapes, that is harmful to animals, that is harmful to workers. I live in Nebraska. There are tons of meatpacking plants along the edge of Lincoln because we have a large immigrant community here, and those are good jobs for immigrants. They actually pay reasonably well. Now they make you very sick, and it's very hard, exhausting work, but they will attract a lot of workers in these small towns around Lincoln. And it was galling to watch during COVID, for example. These meatpacking companies were just straight up lying about who had COVID, how many people had COVID, what they were doing to protect their workers. They were just lying about all this stuff because people had to they had to keep their factory or their meatpacking plants going. And that's an example, I think, of when these relationships we have to have because we have to eat. It's a relationship we have to have. And the way many of these relationships in America are structured are really, really bad for many of the parties in the relationship. So that's what I'm thinking. That's one example. You could run with that in any number of directions. And that's part of what's important, is that part of what I want to argue in the book is that there's no large political movement in America right now that actually does consistently respect what is natural. So on the one hand, if I am talking, so like we live 3 blocks from a grocery co-op in town, where we're members and we're in there a lot.
right.
If I start talking to folks there about how blowing the tops off of mountains to access coal is to defile something that God has made that's beautiful, they will be nodding along with me and they will be tracking. On the other hand, if I were to talk to conservatives about how pumping cross-gender hormones into a teenager is a violation of the integrity of their body and is likely to do significant damage to their body long term, they're nodding along with me. But nobody wants to try and consistently attend to the voice of nature in how they approach all aspects of their life. We all want to be able to play some form of dominance politics, whether that's dominating our bodies and doing things with them that cut against their design, or that's doing that to the natural world. We're not defined by a politics of deference to nature or politics of care for the world as it's made. We're chiefly defined, I think, right and left in America by this sense that what I encounter outside of myself is basically an accessory to my existence. And I can do what I want with it to suit my desires, my needs, my ambitions, my insecurities. And that just has all kinds of really horrible downstream consequences. Simone Weil, is a French mystic, Christian in the mid 20th century. She calls this force. It's the idea that everything outside of me is basically just matter, and I can do what I want with it. It's Joe Rigney, who's a pastor up in the Twin Cities, will talk about reality being Play-Doh. And so what I'm trying to push against is all forms of public thinking and public life that view the rest of the world as Plato, that reject the ontological density of our neighbors, of our own bodies, of creation itself. And I'm trying to instead propose a politics of care, and a politics of, I mean, in a certain sense, conservatism, because it's about moving slowly, trying to understand how God has made the world, and trying to act in the world in ways that don't violate that order, which is just going to inherently lend itself to whatever the opposite of move fast and break things is. And all of this is extremely countercultural, because move fast and break things is the model, is like the motto of one of America's largest economic hubs right now, the tech sector. And I just find all of that deeply destructive, deeply corrosive of neighborliness, of common life, of creation. And I think we need to reject all of that, like, pervasively, not just in the areas where it kind of suits our existing political affiliations. And
so we need integrity and consistency in our views of the world and nature, and our critique of culture. We need consistency, and one of the things that you bring out is natural law. You've said it a few times, when things go against nature. There's something, obviously very rich and a robust tradition of natural law. People that listen to the podcast, we have a large, diverse swath of people that listen, from atheists to Muslims and liberals and conservatives. So the point is that they may not know, some of them, what natural law is. What are we talking about when we're talking about natural law? This is a key part of your argument.
Yeah.
What do we talk about when we're talking about natural law? What does nature teach us? Why should we pay attention to nature teaching me that my DNA says that I'm biologically male? Why does that matter?
Yeah.
Why should we care about what nature is naturally doing when we can just force it to do what we want?
The basic idea of natural law is that there is a kind of moral order that adheres within reality, just as much as there's like the law of gravity or laws of physics. There's also a kind of moral law.
Immutable law, it's there, can't be broken. I mean, you can't get rid of it.
Yep. Now we could really get into the weeds on like how this, because there's God's law, there's natural law, there's human positive law, like there's all kinds of ways. So like there's a difference between the natural law and like legal codes that apply in Lincoln or Lancaster County here in southeast Nebraska.
Right.
But what Christianity would traditionally say is that legal norms should not contradict natural law. And natural law is kind of disclosed to us in the world as this kind of subspecies of God's law. So we will never exhaust all of God's law because we're finite and fallible.
Yes.
He's not. But because God is merciful to us, because he is kind, he discloses truth to us. I mean, in Scripture, for Christians, we would say Scripture is the first place you go. It's the tiebreaker, as it were, when you've got competing authority claims. But God's disclosure of himself to us is not limited to Scripture. He also reveals himself in the world. So, like, one of the ways that I'll talk about this sometimes is, to take one example, it is actually quite natural, understood this way, to love one another because we can't live in the world without that. Every person that exists comes into the world as a result of their body being cared for by someone else's before they ever enter the world. And so each of us enters the world with this kind of indebtedness already because of the love we received as we were carried by our mother. And so there's these ways we can just look at what naturally happens in reality and say, like, this seems to be, like, maybe another way of saying is, like, natural law is, in terms of, like, specific guidance, like, here is my moral dilemma. I don't know if I should do X or Y. Natural law is going to probably be fairly underdetermined for answering those kind of questions. It's not going to tell you, well, you must do X or you must do Y. It's going to say, here are principles of reality. This is the way the world works, and it is good for you to align yourself to that. Now, what that looks like in a specific setting can vary from place to place a little bit. But that's kind of the underlying idea, is there's this kind of order inherent in the way the world is made, such that we can say, like, there really is an ought in how we live. Like, you can say what you're doing agrees with the design of nature, or it does not agree with the design of nature. I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling now, but
No. I'm thinking it's good because so would you say that natural law, like the way that we get at an understanding, let me rephrase this. What's the relationship between something like science, methodological science, and or scientific investigation and natural law? Like what and for instance, like if we start feeling like this natural law or things that we're discovering with natural law come in conflict with something we might feel like was revealed in scripture to us, maybe like evolution, creation, those kind of things.
Sure. I don't want to wade too much into the science question because I just don't. It's been so long since I've done much reading on faith and science issues. I don't want to say something I shouldn't because I haven't had time to think about it.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So, yeah, I do think we can say that our ability to access the natural law is compromised because of sin. And so I cannot look at the world using only my reason and my eyes and come to, like, infallible knowledge about the natural law because I'm fallen. I'm cursed by sin. I'm also a finite human being with limited capacities. And so there's inherent limits in what we can say and do with natural law.
Yes.
And for Christians, this isn't a problem because we're saying that's not the only way that God discloses himself to us. It becomes more of a problem, in my view, for, like, if you are looking at, like, the American founding and the ways that some of our founders who aren't Christians want to use nature. I'm listening to a book right now about some of this, and sometimes you're listening to it and you get the idea that, like, you're just kind of making stuff up and saying it's natural, but you don't really have any way of backing that up.
I mean, the natural law, that kind of philosophy was behind statements like, our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, correct?
Yeah. They're working very closely from John Locke, especially there, and John Locke is doing a lot of work around what natural law is. And so, yeah, like, I think it is good to be modest about some of these things. And I think when you're critiquing older parts of the natural law tradition, like a friend of mine did a translation of a book on natural law by a 16th century Lutheran. And I read it and I remember just being shocked at how much this guy thought we could learn from nature.
Wow.
And he's
like, what do you mean?
So for this guy, his name's Hemmingson. It's been a few years since I've read it, so hopefully I'm remembering all of it well. Hemmingson kind of starts with, he has this idea that honor is this kind of concept that people can naturally understand and wrap their minds around and understand that it is good to live in honorable ways and it is wrong to live dishonorably. And he kind of builds out a lot of what he wants to say about morals and ethics and natural law from that foundation. And it's amazing how much he thinks we can just naturally understand of what is honorable, in ways that would go far beyond what any like contemporary natural law people would say. So yeah, there's all sorts of debate and discussion within the tradition about how some of these things work, how far can we get, what can we know. What I would want to say, like, as just kind of a place to camp out, is to say, natural law, natural revelation is not the only form of revelation that we're given. And so we're given revelation through Scripture, we're given revelation through Christ himself, we're given revelation through nature. These are all forms of the same God disclosing himself to us. And so they will all agree. And so like the way Francis Schaeffer, who was a hero of mine when I was younger, I spent 2 summers at L'Abri, which is a ministry that he started. The way Schaeffer would talk about it sometimes is he said, imagine you have, you find an old book in your attic and it's just the spine and then most of the pages have been torn off. And so you just have some letters by the spine that you can read. You can tell that this is a book because you have the spine, you have the pages. You can tell that it's written in some kind of language because you can look at the letters and maybe piece some words together. But that's as far as you can get. But then if somebody comes along and hands you this bundle of torn up pages and you set it next to the book and it lines up and you can read everything now, you can have a fair degree of confidence that you've like got the whole book together. Because what you got given to you by this other source is lining up with what you already had. And so that was how Schaeffer kind of proposed the relationship with natural law worked.
That's a cool
it's like
analogy, yeah.
Yeah, you're not, for Christians, you're not only dependent on nature to know things. But you can know things from nature.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, I totally, that just intuitively makes a ton of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like almost in some of my experience in my tradition I grew up in, Pentecostal, Assemblies of God, East Coast, I feel like in my experience it wasn't even that, like, it was almost like people didn't even think natural laws had anything to say to us. Mm-hmm. It was like, it was all about the special revelation, which is, of course, the idea that God reveals himself through his creation, and then he reveals himself in a special way, right, to people. Like, we couldn't deduce from looking at creation that God would send his son to die, as an act of atonement, to forgive for the forgiveness of sins. So it's almost like this weird, like, sense that we have to come and bring some balance into these 2 areas and embrace these 2 things of natural law, and allow the scriptures to inform and shape our view of nature. So when I look, let me put it this way: when I go to the Bible, I have a very clear, there's theological method, right? There's very clear hermeneutical steps you take. There's a process. It's been well defined. It's been a road that's been well traveled. And so I feel some sense of confidence of going from the scripture to an understanding about who God is.
Yeah.
How do I go from the process of scientific investigation or process of just observing the world around us and making inferences and making, having assumptions that we basically use as we walk through and navigate this world? How do we move from what the data that we observe and the phenomenon that we observe to making an inference about what God is like.
Mm-hmm.
And even more beyond what God is like to what we're like, and it informs how we're to treat each other or live in this life. Does the question make sense?
I think so. So I guess the kind of first point I'd want to make is that part of what's helpful about having a thick idea of nature rather than the world just being Play-Doh.
Thick idea of nature. So
Right. So part of what's helpful about it is if you have the idea that there is this kind of order in the world that we must respect in some way.
we
Now,
can't just make it do what we want without consequence.
right. The world is not your sandbox, your plaything to just do whatever you want to it. You have certain obligations to the world and to your neighbor. And that's the way the world is meant to work. If you start from there, then as we talk with our neighbors, as we talk to other community members in our city or where we work or our church, wherever God leads you, we're talking about something together that we can both point at and recognize this is the thing we're talking about and these are the things we want. That's a very different conversation than if reality is just Play-Doh and we're fighting over who gets to hold and shape the Play-Doh. It's the difference between like two kids playing in the sand, fighting over what shape they're going to make or how they're going to make their sandcastle, and maybe two people preparing a meal together who both want the same kind of end product, and
Right.
they can taste what they're making and they can see what they're making, and they can together recognize, oh, that's burning. That's bad. Let's change that. Or, oh, that doesn't taste right. Let's add this. So it gives us something in common to reason about and talk about, which it sounds obvious, but I think in a lot of cases we don't actually have that right now.
No, I hear you.
So when you look at our politics basically are this never-ending fight over who gets to have power. And that just doesn't give you any basis for pursuing anything together with people that don't already agree with you. Because all that we're doing is fighting over who has power. And if that's all you're doing, then the people who want the other guys to have power are just your enemies, the end.
Right.
That's a terrible way to live together as a community, because you're just going to bump into people that don't agree with you about things, and you're either going to have a way of dealing with that or you're not. And if you don't, you're not going to live in a very pleasant city or country. So I think having that thick idea of, no, like we're living in a world that you could almost say wants to be treated in a certain way, is really important for everybody. Now, again, for Christians, we would say you can't purely from natural revelation, for instance, learn that Jesus came from God and died on your behalf so that you could be reconciled to God. You can't get that from nature. But what I think you can get from nature is you can, if you see a movie or you read a story where somebody sacrifices themselves so that others can live. I mean, spoiler alert, Harry Potter. People respond to the beauty that they can detect in that action.
Right.
They're moved in some way by it.
Yes.
Or I think, and you can see these dynamics play out on social media. If a video leaks of, going back to a food example, I guess. If a video leaks of animals being mistreated in a meatpacking plant, people react to that because they look at that and they say, there is something wrong in how that animal is being treated. And so it's that kind of intuitive sense, that thing that gets activated inside you when you see,
intuitive moral sense.
yeah, like that's the kind of thing I would want to like talk about with somebody. Like, you are deeply moved, rightly, by that act of sacrifice that you saw, or you are angered, rightly, by this thing that you saw happen on your timeline, this video that you saw on your social media timeline. Where does that sense of outrage or that sense of joy come from? And I mean, this is where C.S. Lewis starts out so many of his kind of appeals for the faith. Mere Christianity starts in natural law, for example.
Yes.
And Lewis himself comes to faith because he recognizes that the world that I love, the world of this literature that captures my heart and lifts me up into the heavens, as it were, I don't think that world is real. And the world that I think is real, I don't much like. And then he's talking to Tolkien one night and Hugo Dyson, and Tolkien suggests to him that Christ is the true myth. And so he is the like real world figure who lived in space-time history, who sacrificed himself in history as this kind of like real world instantiation of all of those things you love in your literature. And he ties reality to these ideals and makes them real. And that was kind of Lewis's in to Christian faith, was to be able to say, that's it. And he even has a line in one of his books about how if I have desire, like the learning from his desires, learning from what stirred his soul, that's the, I'm not going to quote the line because I'm going to butcher it. That's the starting point for him as he moves toward faith. And so I think that's where we can, many people are going to have these experiences. You know, there's, I mean, I guess, I mean, I remember the days our kids were born. In that sense, like holding one of our kids for the first time and feeling this deep, like within me, something arising up within me, telling me what I owed to that child. I think there are lots of things like that, and you can almost always find something where people encounter something in the world and they have this stirring in themselves that tells them, because of what I'm seeing, I need to do X. So
it's like this. And so the idea is that there's certain principles of nature that aren't, as you put it, they're not like Play-Doh that we can take, we can shape to our image, whatever we want. They just they're fixed.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you mean by the givenness and goodness that create a world?
Yes. Yeah. And
so givenness is that it's fixed. It's just a given.
We live in a world that we did not make to our specifications. We live in a world that was given to us at birth, ultimately by God, but also given to us by other people.
Right.
You know, I live in southeast Nebraska because 80 years ago, when my grandfather came back from World War II, he chose to live in Lincoln. Right. And 140 years ago, my great-grandparents chose to come here from Sweden.
Right.
And so so much of my experience of the world is not stuff that I choose and make for myself. It's stuff that's given to me when I come into the world. And you can rage against that if you want, but you're going to encounter that so many times in so many different ways that your whole life is just going to kind of be raging against reality. Or you can, this again is Lewis in Abolition of Man. He says that for the wise men of old, the chief problem was how to fit the soul to reality. And the answer was virtue. But for moderns, the chief problem is how to fit reality to the wishes and desires of men. And the answer is technique. Um, and so what I'm saying is it is better to go with the ancients and say, I'm going to try and align myself with the given world rather than constantly be warring with everything that I didn't choose about my life to try and bring it into conformity with my own wishes and ambitions.
Well, that makes sense. So how would that play out for me, say, in how I would view an issue like immigration or something like that?
Um, yeah, so there's two different ways you can go on that. Um, on the one hand, um, I'm just going to go straight to the policy questions we
Yeah,
haven't
go
addressed.
ahead.
I assume that's what you're talking about. Um, I think it is a mistake to say that any kind of concern with large amounts of immigration is inherently racist, or that national
Okay.
borders are inherently wrong, which is
Right.
some of the talking points you'll get from the American left right now.
Right.
It is a good thing for people to desire to live together with one another, with a shared way of life, common community. And
Right.
one of the things that I'll bring up sometimes in these conversations is like I spent a summer in Zambia when I was in college. It's when I first started wearing the dashikis because a Zambian friend bought me one, and I've been wearing them since. And when I was in Zambia, one of the big debates they were having was how to curb Chinese immigration to Zambia because
Mm.
China was coming in and taking over huge chunks of the Zambian economy, and it was not good for Zambians. And so they were wanting to tighten down immigration restrictions for that reason. And I mean, we're here today, like, China actually controls the only international airport in Uganda, for example.
Mm.
So Uganda's government does not control the international airport in its own country
That's
because of the
crazy.
way their economic relationships with China have been structured. So I think it's a good thing for Zambia or Uganda 10 years ago, if they could have, to be able to say, no, we want to have tighter border restrictions because, like, what is happening is not good for our people. Um, on the other hand, um, we are living in the world after colonialism. So we are living in a world where mostly Western and Northern Europeans and Americans spent several hundred years uprooting traditional cultures and ways of life all over the world. Um,
Yeah.
and here's the wild thing: there were Christians warning us about this when we were doing it. Herman Bavinck, when he was a Dutch member of Parliament in 1911, gave a speech where he told the Dutch church, if we allow the spread of Christianity to be tied to the spread of colonialism, here's what's going to happen. We're not going to be exporting Christianity to these places. We're going to be exporting capitalism. We're going to destroy ways of life, ways of living in the world, communities, cultures. We're going to destroy all of it. And all we're going to give them to replace it is the market. And that is going to feed a backlash against all of these things as all of these people feel uprooted, they feel robbed, they feel lied to. And I mean, so here's Herman Bavinck in 1911 anticipating Al Qaeda, for example. um, and so we had people warning us about this, but too late now. Um, and so I think it is, while it's not wrong for countries to sometimes say, we want to have tighter immigration restrictions because this is not good for our country to have this many immigrants coming in. I think it is also wrong for countries that spent centuries destroying coherent, integrated cultures that had been in place for ages to then turn around and say, well, we destroyed your country, and destroyed your work, we destroyed your way of life, and now you want to come here to make a living, but we won't let you come in. Like, I don't think that's right either. So it creates really hard questions on an issue like immigration, because I do think there is such a thing as good nationalism, even good nationhood. But you have to use just weights and measures, and you don't get to spend, I mean, so I did my undergrad thesis on African post-colonial history, so I'm deep in these sources. The UK Prime Minister comes back to England in the 1880s from the Conference of Berlin, where they chopped up Africa into all of these different, utterly fabricated colonial states that had no historical precedent whatever. And he comes back to England and he tells a journalist, yeah, we've been dividing up rivers and savannas and mountains, and the only problem is we didn't know exactly where they are. It's like, really, dude? But that's what we did. And so we created these utterly fabricated nation states all over the world, not just in Africa, but in Western Asia and Central America, South America. We created these contrived national entities. Like when I was in Zambia, I remember talking to people and they were like, yeah, before colonialism, our closest kind of allies and friends historically were on the other side of the river. But after colonialism, that became Zimbabwe and this is Zambia, and we're in different countries. So it just completely uprooted our way of life, because suddenly we were expected to be in national relationships with total strangers and not be in relationship with people we'd been close to for centuries. And so immigration gets very, very difficult because we're living in the aftermath of all that destruction. And it also gets very difficult in a context like the US because of our racial history, which you're seeing now with the revival of things like replacement theory and all that stuff. So there's so many different angles to it, and you need to be drawing on history and political theory and moral reasoning and all these different kind of strands to be able to act wisely, which is part of what makes it really, really hard. But
yeah, absolutely. It's like, go ahead.
No, but I mean, that's also part of, to go back to the idea of a natural order. You want to talk about, when do we start losing the idea that there is something in the world that obliges me to treat people and places in a certain way? Well, let's talk about colonialism. Like, that's where a lot of this stuff starts.
Right.
You get these European powers going into North America, later into Africa, India, Australia, and they're encountering people and cultures and languages and religions and ways of life, ways of taking care of the land. And they don't see any of it. All they see are people we can exploit and wealth that we can take. And because they don't see any of that, they do really horrible things. I mean, I live in Nebraska. This should be prairie, where I'm living now. It should be a certain kind of healthy landscape that is a relationship between people and animals and the geography itself. And it's not. Because 120 years ago, a bunch of white folks came out here and they killed millions of buffalo and plowed up all the prairie. So the landscape is just unrecognizable today compared to what it was 200 years ago. And as you get further west, it gets more extreme. We're going to have a water crisis in the western part of this country. Not just in places like Phoenix, but even for like orchards and farms in the Northwest. Idaho is going to have a bit of a farming apocalypse on their hands in the not that distant future, because they have these ways of farming and caring for the land that are so resource intensive that they can't be sustained on that kind of landscape. And yet the people that were here before us had lived on these lands for centuries without problems because they understood those relationships. But when the colonialists arrived, they didn't see the relationships. And so they just tore a ton of stuff up and kind of asked questions later, if at all. And here we are. We have a climate change problem now.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, that's part of what's interesting about talking about nature in this way, is that it actually cuts against a lot of right-wing stuff as much as it cuts against left-wing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really it does take a view of politics that is kind of transcendent in the sense, transcending and rising above kind of the
Mm-hmm.
normal talking points and culture that had to do with both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, right, the right and left
Yeah.
in America. And it's been such a fascinating conversation. I just have one more question for you. So, when as Christians that are we're working in this world, we're trying to figure things out. We're trying to, and what I've heard you say is that there's this mixture of really good theology and really good like natural law, like understanding, really good grasp of the world. It's understanding how things are supposed to work, or getting a sense of how they should work, gives you a real advantage in terms of actually knowing if what you're doing is damaging, or if it's or if it's okay, neutral, or if it's actually beneficial, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like just getting the sense of the world is so important, to try to understand and understand the principles, so we don't try to violate them and shape something in a way that's going to like ultimately cause damage for us, or it's just ultimately like an exercise of futility. And as you're thinking about the future of the church in America and living out, if they could live out this kind of vision that you have, what would begin to change? What would life look like in the church?
Get these kind of questions often, but I don't know that they ever like become normal, because it's just it's such a hopeful question, but it's such a hard question.
Sure.
It
Yeah.
feels very big, and it feels very removed from the reality we have right now.
Right.
Like the reality we have right now is that a ton of our churches were torn to shreds by whether or not to wear a face mask. And so to move from that to these bigger questions can feel very remote and very hard.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What I think I would say is that, um, oh, maybe L'Abri is a good place to land it, because L'Abri is such a huge part of my story. It's this Christian community that lives by faith, so they don't fundraise. They trust God to provide what they need. Kind of the George Muller model, if you're familiar with him. He was a 19th century British evangelical activist who like ran orphanages and things like that. What I've found at L'Abri, and I found it as a student there, I have found it as a speaker at their conferences, I've found it when I speak at a L'Abri branch, is this very deep and profound sense of beloved community that can't be explained really by anything but grace. Not just in the sense that it exists by grace, because God gives the money for it to somehow exist, even when they don't fundraise. They've been around for like 67 years. They've been living this way. No fundraising. And so they exist by grace in that sense. It's also a certain act of grace that the very eclectic group of people that pass through a L'Abri can all receive love and welcome there. And I think part of what is so striking about that is when you do dedicate yourself to trying to live in a way that is alert to the ways that God has made the world to work, and that is open to your neighbors, there's certain joys to be had in that I think we often don't lay hold of because we don't live in that way. And so we don't really know what we're missing out on. Like, I just think about there's such a pleasure in, and I tell this story in the book, my roommate and I spent a morning muddy, cold, miserable morning, tearing up these evil weeds that had taken over the woods by the Labrie house. Um, and then we came inside for tea, because if you're at Labrie, you have tea in the morning and the afternoon, because that is what we do. If you're at the Rochester Labrie and you dare to have anything other than PG tips with milk and sugar, the director will mock you. He will let you have your organic tea. He calls it millennial tea. But he will tease you. Um, but you come in from that work, and there's like the day that I will always remember. There's a fire in the stove. It's warm. There's a relaxing kind of bluesy record playing in the background. People are sitting around talking, and you're expected. Um, there's that line near the end of, I think it's the way Return of the King ends with Tolkien. Sam returns home, and his wife draws him in and sets the baby in his lap. And Sam looks at her and says, "Well, I'm back." And it's like he's in the place he's supposed to be, with the people he's supposed to be with. Um, I would hope that we would see more communities like that are able to draw people in that way, to give them a place, um, to invite them into good work, into conversation, into trust. We live in such a low trust society right now. Um, so to invite people into communities where trust actually exists, I think these are the things that we're called to do. And I think there are Christians doing it. They just tend to be quiet, and the work flies under the radar a little bit. But it's happening. I know it's happening at Labrie. I know it's happening with the Bruderhof, which is this radical Christian community that they publish Plough. So that's who I work for, or one of the people I work for. And I know that there are churches where this happens. I was baptized in an utterly remarkable little PCA church plant. And I remember the pastor, when he baptized me, praying for me. I was 18, and I had not been baptized in the church I grew up in for complicated reasons that don't matter. But I remember that pastor praying for me after he baptized me, and having the thought that this pastor knows me better than anybody at the church I grew up at had known me. And so to have those kind of relationships where you feel genuinely seen by another person, we're so starved for community that I think there's a certain sense in which the bar we have to clear is not that high. Be attentive to your neighbors, welcome them in, be friendly, be hospitable, create places of warmth and safety. And I think that alone in this particular moment could be incredibly powerful. And I think it has to start there. Barry always will say, you do what you can with what you have where you are. So That's the work.
Well, I love it. That's so good. Jake, I really appreciate you being on.
Thanks for having me.
How can people follow your work? Where can they go to get your book? How can they follow your work? What do you have going on next?
Yeah. So you can buy the book at bookshop.org, or on the IVP website, or on Amazon. Leaving reviews on Amazon is helpful to authors.
Nice. Yes.
I've got a personal website, jakemeador.com. I do have a Twitter handle, but I don't monitor that because Twitter is bad. And so I auto post to it because it's kind of a professional thing for being in media. And so I have the account, but I don't monitor it, and I post to it from an app where I never see the timeline. So I just don't follow it. I just post stuff through Buffer and forget about it.
I understand.
So the website is the best way to reach me, and Bookshop or Amazon's the way to buy the book. Right now, I'm just trying to kind of grow Mere Orthodoxy. I've been doing it full-time since January. God willing, this is what I'll be doing full-time for a long time, if we can get the money together. So we're selling subscriptions, fundraising, all that stuff.
That's great.
So,
well, thank you so much, Jake. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
It's been good.
And guys, well, this has been Jake Meador, and check out his stuff. Make sure you leave a review on Amazon, and we will see you guys next time. Thanks for the great conversation. See you later.
Thanks.